Good morning. So let's continue from where we left off. So today I just want to introduce uh, some applications of molecular dynamic simulations, just to tell you in what way this particular tool has been used for various research activities. So the first these examples that I'm going to show you are from research articles. IIT Madras has a subscription to some of these articles, and these are the various figures and tables and videos will be shown in order to just introduce you to the kind of things that people have done using molecular simulations. However, please note that it is not required for you to actually have these articles in order to answer questions in the assignment or in the exam. This is just to give you a flavor of how what sort of things people can do with molecular dynamics simulations. So the first example that I'm going to show concerns the mechanical behavior of a CNT aluminum composite. So it's very clear, that carbon nanotubes have played a very important role in improving several properties of materials, and mechanical properties is one amongst them. And in this particular article, which is there in Composites B, the authors have actually used molecular simulations in order to see what happens when you put carbon nanotubes inside an aluminum matrix and examine the toughness and the elastic properties of this composite material. So it's a good idea to actually take a look at what they have done. So I'm going to just open up the article from that. This is the article here. So if your university actually has a subscription to this journal, please take a look at this particular article. It's extremely interesting. So the paper basically investigates the mechanical behavior of the composite material, where they put carbon nanotubes. They want to put carbon nanotubes and in an aluminum matrix, and change the type or the size of the carbon nanotube, perform an axial test to examine the mechanical properties, in particular the Young's modulus and the toughness of the composite material. So if you take a look at the abstract, in brief, what did they find after they performed this analysis? They were able to conclude things such as saying that the Young's modulus of the composite material improved by nearly 31% for a particular type of carbon nanotube, 33 for the other, and nearly 39 for a third different type of carbon nanotube. They also found that the corresponding toughness values of these composite material was significantly different when compared to the aluminum itself. So in this manner, molecular dynamic simulations can be used in order to examine the mechanical properties or the qualitative features exhibited by materials when different modifications are actually done to them. So in brief, what did they do? They basically simulated a small portion of a dog bone specimen. A dog bone specimen is basically an example. You don't really do the entire dog bone specimen in MD. You do a small portion of it. So assuming that this is a small portion that they have taken, and you see the behavior right here in figure 1, where the carbon nanotube sits right in the center and it is surrounded by the aluminum matrix, right? So they have to give proper interactions existing between the carbon nanotube material, which is basically carbon, and the aluminum atoms, and of course between aluminum and also between the carbon atoms. And once they give this sort of an interaction and they perform a tensile test using molecular dynamic simulations, you are essentially able to plot something that looks like a stress strain diagram for various combinations of carbon nanotube and aluminum, and conclude on what happens to the elastic properties and what happens to the overall toughness of the entire material. Not only do they actually have these conclusions on the Young's modulus and the toughness, but if you look at figure 5 and also figure 9 here, they are able to say something about the fundamental mechanisms that is actually governing the matrix failure when they look at the atomistic behavior of the material. So they are able to show that there are voids that are going to be formed and slip bands that actually are generated when such, and how these things vary in the presence of this carbon nanotube are also discussed. So in this manner, it is possible for us to look at atomistic level features in order to explain some of the observed macroscopic properties, such as changes in the Young's modulus or changes in the changes in the toughness of the material. So this is one application where we talk about the mechanical property variation. So now let's look at something else. So that was with respect to metals. Now I will show you an example with silicon carbide, which is essentially a ceramic. So as you all may be knowing, nanocrystalline materials are have several interesting properties, and nanocrystalline silicon carbide is particularly interesting because it is expected to have high resistance to something called as radiation damage. Furthermore, it is useful for electronic applications, and is also used as a tool in order to for machining purposes. Now, when you have nanocrystalline silicon carbide, some of these properties are expected to be enhanced, right? So in related works, which is there in these two articles, Applied Physics Letters and Science, MD simulations of nanocrystalline silicon carbide have shown very interesting results, and it's not the previous example that we saw was a single crystal aluminum and you had a piece of carbon nanotube in between, but this particular science paper actually deals with constructing nanocrystalline silicon carbide. So I will show you a few pictures from the paper. They have several different grains in their sample, in their MD simulation, each grain consisting of atoms, array of atoms which are oriented in different directions, and they perform an indentation test on this sample, and they try to understand the load displacement response and conclude on various fundamental physics as far as this particular material is concerned. So let's take a look at this. So this is a paper, science paper. So I will show you some pictures which is representing the kind of simulation system that they are using. So this is your nanocrystalline silicon carbide, and they have used several different grains. Each of these grains are actually colored differently, and you can see the indenter right here. I'm pointing to the indenter over here, right? And when they perform this indentation, you get a load displacement graph, and from this load displacement graph, it's possible for us to look at several features of the material. So it's a good idea to actually take a look at this book if you are having subscription to. If you're able to get hold of this particular paper, you can take a look at this article. So in this manner, it is not just a single crystalline material that one can actually deal with in molecular simulations, but it's also possible to construct nanocrystalline materials and look at their behavior. Okay, so in this article, primarily they found that there are new mechanisms that are taking place beneath the indenter, and they could see how dislocations are actually emitted beneath the indenter. Of course, this dislocation emission is more clear in the Applied Physics Letters paper. This is the nano indentation induced amorphization in silicon carbide. So this is the load displacement plot that they have, and this is of course not really nanocrystalline material that they have used. They have used a single crystalline material, but on performing the indentation, they have marked these atoms which are deviating from their normal behavior, and they're able to look at the manner in which these dislocations are actually emitted beneath the indenter when they indent ceramic materials such as silicon carbide. So this is an example showing the mechanical behavior of a ceramic material. And another thing that I would like to point out is that the science paper that I just discussed here uses atoms in the order of about 20 million for performing these simulations. As you can see, some of their grains are quite large, in the order of about 8 nanometers, right? So it's actually quite large when you consider this to be atomistic simulation. So the total number of atoms that they had were about 20 million atoms, which is huge. So some of these simulations can be expected to take a very long time to actually complete, and therefore you must be careful enough to set your input files in a manner so that if if the job dies in between, you should be able to restart it from the point where it actually stopped. So some of these things are extremely important. And another example that I would like to point out is in manufacturing. So like I mentioned in the previous class, what is important about MD simulation is to see if you can get some qualitative insights into the material behavior, and not always worry about the matching of the numbers between your experiments and your simulations. So one such example is actually machining of brittle materials. So silicon being a brittle material, it's hard to machine using conventional techniques, right? It's just too brittle. Single point diamond turning based machining operation seems to be a good option in order to machine and get ultra high surface finishes in these materials. So there's a paper here, International Journal of Machine Tools and Manufacture. So this is just to point out that molecular dynamic simulations is also being used in manufacturing area. So it's not restricted to material science or mechanical engineering or in determining just thermodynamic properties, but it has been extended to several other areas as well. So we can take a look at this paper here, which is there in the International Journal of Machine Tools and Manufacture. There's a lot of stuff which you can actually take a look at, but mainly I would like to point out to this particular figure here, where they have the substrate which is basically silicon, and this is your diamond tool, and that is essentially machining this entire material right here. And based, of course, it's important to know what they find out. So they found out that various process parameters can be changed in order to improve the manner in which the high pressure transformation takes place beneath the indenter, which can actually enable improvement in other quantities that are related to manufacturing. So of course these examples are very qualitative. I don't intend to actually go through the entire article and tell you exactly what they did. This is just to provide a brief overview of what in what applications molecular dynamic simulations have actually been used by various people, by various researchers. Another example, so we saw some examples on mechanical behavior. We saw an example where MD simulations have come of use in manufacturing or in machining operations. Another example where it can be used in the thermal area is to determine thermal conductivity at certain interfaces. You can determine the thermal conductivity of some materials even in their bulk phase. But what is interesting in this particular article that I'm about to show is a manner in which the presence of certain interfaces change the manner in which heat flow, or causes a sharp increase in the resistance to heat flow. So this is actually from a paper in Nano Letters. So thermal transport across twin grain boundaries in polycrystalline graphene from non-equilibrium molecular dynamic simulations. So if you just take a look at this paper right here, this figure right here in the abstract, so they built atomistic models of graphene. So this is all graphene right here, and you see that the orientations of this side and the orientations of this side, orientation of this side and orientation of this side are all different. Consequently, you have some sort of a mismatch between these differently oriented graphene sheets, and it is interesting to know what happens when heat flows in such material. So this is the plot of the temperature versus position across this distance, and they see that there is a linear variation in temperature with position here. So you can take the slope of this to relate that to your thermal conductivity. But at this particular point where the grain boundary is existing, there is a sharp jump, right? There's a sharp jump, basically indicating that there is some sort of a higher resistance to heat flow at these grain boundaries. It's possible this has also been done not only on graphene sheets but also on other bulk materials with grain boundaries. So it's possible for us to find out thermal conductivity as well. So you can find out thermal conductivity of materials using molecular dynamic simulations, and there are several different approaches to do that. In this, they have actually taken a direct approach where they maintain different temperatures in different regions in order to obtain that jump in the temperature profile, and hence evaluate the thermal conductivity. So you can take a more detailed look at this particular paper if you are interested in calculating these aspects for your research work. So that's an example where you calculate thermal conductivity with MD simulations. Another example where we have molecular dynamic simulations is in radiation damage of materials. So in radiation damage, what happens is we are talking about materials which are used in nuclear fusion or fission reactors, and simply because of the fact that there is a lot of activity in these reactors, ions, electrons or neutrons may actually bombarding the structural materials in these reactors, and consequently when a material is being bombarded with high energy atoms, you create what are referred to as point defects. You may create vacancies, interstitials or antisites, and as these defects actually increase in number, the thermomechanical properties of these materials are expected to degrade over time. So it is interesting to know how many such defects are going to be produced in the material. So this is clearly an atomistic level phenomena, and furthermore the time scales over which the cascade happens, or not, the process happens where the atom is coming and hitting and creating a few defects in the material, is actually in the same order of magnitude as it happens, as you can capture using MD simulations. So this entire process generally happens in the order of a few tens of picoseconds in the real system, and MD simulations are excellent in capturing phenomena that happens in few tens of picoseconds, like I mentioned in the previous class. So MD simulation is perfect for actually capturing these events, which are referred to as primary damage events. And I will show you some videos which, this is an example of lithium metatitanate, and you can see one particular atom moving all of a sudden and creating a small cascade region here. This is a molecular dynamic simulations of this particular cascade event in lithium metatitanate, and it creates, you wait long enough, and after some time you create a small region which consists of point defects, whereas the remaining region surrounding it is still crystalline or perfect crystal. And what we are interested in is looking at how these point defects are evolving with time, and what is at the end of the cascade. Cascade means the process by which the atom is getting bombards this particular material to create point defects, and we can perform some analysis on this to basically see how these point defects are basically evolving with time. So for example, these are typical kind of plots that you may get when you are looking at how these defects are actually generated over time. So we see that the total time scale over which this entire simulation has taken place is about 10 picoseconds, and you can see some defects which are still increasing even after the cascade is completed, whereas some of these defects, such as lithium antisites, have kind of settled down to more or less a constant value. So some of the results of this simulation is also, you could also take it to higher level calculations and perform further analysis on them. For example, the number of defects that is being generated during primary damage may serve as an input to something called as rate theory model, where you could try to analyze what happens at even longer time scales when the defects begin to actually diffuse. So this is an example, another example where MD simulations have been used of late. Another example, now so far we have seen some metals, some ceramics, and we saw an example in manufacturing, but molecular dynamic simulations are also used in polymer simulations and also protein simulations to understand various mechanisms related to protein folding and so on and so forth. One of the applications that we were interested in our group is looking at how natural rubber is generally fortified using carbon-based materials such as carbon black, and its strength is generally affected by the strength that the carbon black has with the polymer surface. So in this work, The carbon black was modeled as a graphene sheet, and a polymer was placed on top of it, and we performed extension experiments in order to understand how the system behaved at various rates of pulling. So what was the interface strength at various rates of pulling, and where the failure actually took place. So I will show you some examples of that. So this is an example where we show opening mode of separation of graphene, initial assembly of the unwrapped polymer network. You see the polymer network that's there right on top of it, and the graphene sheet which is there in yellow. That's how we started off the simulation. And then we perform a small equilibration where the polymer and the graphene sheet both come together, and you can see all these polymer atoms being vibrating. In the next step, we separated the polymer from the graphene sheet at various rates. So this is at extremely slow rate. So the rate at which you are actually seeing this being pulled and the rate at which the simulations are being performed need not look the same. Things have been rescaled so that the video appears in within a reasonable time. So this is at some specific rate, and you see that the failure is happening somewhere in the middle of the polymer. This is at somewhat at intermediate rates. That is the behavior that you see, with chains being pulled to a longer extent, slightly faster separation. Right now at intermediate rates, you see that there is more polymer chains that's being stretched, and some of them still being connected to the graphene surface over here. So depending upon the rate at which you pull the polymer, you see different behavior, and that's what is being captured by these simulations. And at extremely high rate, this is at somewhat at intermediate rates, and at extremely high rate, what you see is the polymer does not have enough time to actually respond to the speed with which the graphene is being pulled, and it behaves like a rigid block. Some of these concepts are very are appropriate when you look at the viscoelastic behavior of these polymers, and qualitatively they match. So this is the behavior that I would like to talk about when we this is what I wanted to talk about when I wanted to show the behavior for the polymer material. Another aspect that might be interesting is to look at molecular machines. So Nobel Prize in Chemistry for molecular machines was given in 2016. So the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Jean-Pierre Sauvage, Sir J. Froster Stoddart, and Bernard L. Funiga for the design and production of molecular machines. So some of these machines have also been simulated on the are also there on the internet. You can find cool examples where molecular dynamics simulations are actually showing these behavior. For example, I just wanted to show you some examples from the internet where people have made molecular simulations of these molecular machines. These examples can actually be found on this website right here. So please take a look at this website. You will be able to see some very nice examples of molecular machines which have been built using molecular simulations, molecular dynamic simulations, such as a planetary gear, and there's also a fluid pump, if I'm not mistaken. So these are some of the examples that I just wanted to give just to motivate this course and tell you how molecular simulations are actually useful. Of course, the range of applications extends far beyond the simple examples that I have just pointed out so far. And in this course, being an introductory course, we may not be doing all these advanced applications. We will just learn how to perform some simple molecular dynamic simulations and connect it to some physics that we are all familiar about. But once you know that, performing some of these calculations must also not be very hard, and you must be able to pick it up very quickly. With that, I'd like to conclude this class, and thank you.